5 minutes on policy. I was there during my first tour in Moscow in a very dramatic time when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan 6 months after I arrived, and then I was there through the boycott of the Moscow Olympics and through all of the sanctions that were imposed. It was a very dramatic, a very difficult time in U.S.-Soviet relations. What policies, sometimes people ask what policies were effective, what policies were not. Could we affect Soviet behavior? In my own view, we really could not. We affected it only marginally, I would say. The policies we intended to use were effective only on the margins in terms of the actions that the Soviets themselves wanted to take. You take the example of Afghanistan, which is perhaps a dramatic example. Détente did not deter the invasion of Afghanistan. The sanctions that we imposed afterwards did not really do very much, I think, in influencing Soviet behavior subsequently. Some people argue that they may have deterred the Soviets then in moving into Poland because Solidarność then developed shortly thereafter. I'm rather skeptical about that. I think the Soviets did not go into Poland because the Polish example was not infectious. It was not spreading to other countries, and it was destroying the Polish economy and so on. So they did not have to do that. I think our own policies were, and we can talk about this some more during the discussion, were not particularly effective in influencing Soviet behavior. But I think there were two trends, really, which definitely did have impact. They were in part our policies, but in part they were developments in the world at large. The first one, I think you could credit in part to Jimmy Carter, and that was the human rights issue which developed. And this is particularly, it developed, and I worked on that a lot, with the Helsinki Final Act, with CSCE, OSCE, the whole development of the human rights issue. And I say it was only partly to our credit that this worked because, in fact, we in the West, or at least the United States, did not expect the reaction that the Helsinki Final Act had, of all of these Helsinki monitoring groups being created spontaneously all over Eastern Europe. It was an incredible phenomenon, which of course we grabbed onto and welcomed, but we did not expect it. It was very much, to a large degree, an indigenous development. And, but it did have definitely impact because the Soviets never quite developed an effective counter to the human rights criticism. They tried various things: non-interference in internal affairs, then counter-criticism of Western human rights policies. But they never developed an effective counter. And the human rights issue grew the whole time, I think, throughout my career. And it exerted pressure, I think, from the bottom in the Soviet Union. It did start exerting that very gradually. The second development, I think, which sort of was a policy, and this I would credit a little bit to Ronald Reagan, was the issue of the high-tech revolution. This started in the 70s, the computer rage. It really started, we don't remember now, it started very quickly. It began developing computers everywhere. The Soviets saw this. They saw this phenomenon. And they were very worried about it. They were very worried. They saw how computers were taking off in the West, how kids were growing up learning computers. And then came the big thing, which was ridiculed at the time, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative of Ronald Reagan, which at the time was very controversial. Of course, Reagan was sort of ridiculed for it. But I can tell you, the Soviets took it seriously, and they were terrified of it. I had numerous conversations. They were very scared that something like this would develop. because they knew that the real source of their strength was the nuclear weapons that they had, and that they did not have the strength otherwise to compete with the West. And so whether SDI is possible or is not possible, it had a dramatic effect, I think, in various currents that developed that led to a Mikhail Gorbachev deciding that there had to be a fundamental change in the Soviet Union.